This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at numberfire.com, and this is episode 502 of the Late Round Podcast, one of many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. We finally made it. The NFL Draft is this week. And if you haven't heard, during day 1 and day 2 of the draft, yours truly will be with my colleagues over on the FanDuel YouTube channel breaking everything down live as the picks come in. I'll be providing takes the instant each skill position player is drafted, and I'll be making projections on the fly. You can watch the show on FanDuel's social channels. More specifically, check us out on YouTube. And again, that'll be for day 1 and day 2 of the draft. Lots and lots of live streaming for you. Today, to get you all set up for that draft, I want to talk through my rookie rankings. I've had guests on the show over the last few weeks to talk about the big 3 fantasy football positions. And today, I'll wrap up the pre-draft process by talking through my top 20 players that I'd be targeting right now in single quarterback rookie drafts. And I'll be talking about those top 20 players by tiers. Now, 2 things about this. The first is that you can find these rankings over on numberfire.com. I actually have a top 30 that I wrote up about a week and a half or so ago. I'm providing a little bit more context on today's show about those rankings, but they're there for you on Numberfire. The second thing to note is that these are very obviously pre-draft rookie rankings. The draft hasn't happened yet. Where these players get drafted, both in terms of draft slot and the team, that's going to change where these players fall in my rankings post-draft. These rankings are not just based on my model either. I've said this time and time again, but I use my model to guide me, to spot red flags, to find hidden gems in a particular class. My model influences where I rank players, but it's not the end all, because everything draft related is really unpredictable. So throwing a little subjectivity out there doesn't bother me in my process. So without further ado, let's get to my top 20. In tier 1, I've got 3 players: Najee Harris, Travis Etienne, and Ja'Marr Chase, in that order. You may be wondering what separates each player. That's a good question. They're all in the same tier, so they're relatively interchangeable in rank. The reason I have the running backs above Chase is because running backs just matter more in fantasy football, and they're safer bets given their probable draft capital. But if you want to go Chase with the 101, you have my permission, not that you needed my permission. With Najee Harris, I just think that he's a very solid prospect all around. This class doesn't have a ton of size at either running back or wide receiver. But Harris has that at 230 pounds. And people might view him just as this bruiser because of that size, but he's a really good pass catcher. He had the 6th best reception share among the 24 running backs invited to the combine in this year's draft class. Now, I know the combine didn't happen, but they still had a combine list. I think Harris is the first back off the board. And I do think it might be Pittsburgh who takes him, but we'll see. If he goes to Pittsburgh, it's easy to see him being the 101 in rookie drafts this year. Travis Etienne is probably the most explosive running back and pass catcher at the position in this class. I don't expect him to play at the 215 pounds that he weighed in on his pro day, so there may be some size concerns, but I don't think they're big enough to care. We can only work with the information that we have. The fact is, he had the 6th best total yards per team carry rate in this class, the 3rd best reception share, and he's likely to have strong draft capital. With Etienne, I think we're looking at a DeAndre Swift type prospect. And then finally with Ja'Marr Chase, I've mentioned this before, but when the draft is all said and done, Chase is likely going to be a 99th percentile prospect in my model. That'll put him in a group with Amari Cooper, Mike Evans, Sammy Watkins, Julio Jones, Demaryius Thomas, and Calvin Johnson. A lot of those players were boosted by draft capital, aside from Thomas, who didn't go in the top 20. But they were all very good prospects. And all but Watkins have had insanely good NFL careers. Chase outproduced Justin Jefferson in college when he was a sophomore, and Jefferson was a junior. Jefferson just broke the single-season NFL rookie receiving record. The ceiling is sky high for Ja'Marr Chase. That's why he's in the top tier. Tier 2 starts with Javonte Williams. I'm not sure we see the draft capital for Williams like we see with Najee Harris and Travis Etienne, but I do expect Williams to be the 3rd running back off the board in the draft. And draft capital matters. It not only tells us that a team wanted a player, but at running back especially, those players are going to get opportunity first. And that drives performance in fantasy football. I'm hoping Williams gets good draft capital because I think he's very good. He split a backfield with Michael Carter at North Carolina, and they had comparable production. But Williams has the size, and that size aspect of things matters at running back if we're looking for a ceiling. That size also allowed him to break Pro Football Focus's record for broken tackles per attempt. That's what he did last season. I do think that there is some concern about Javonte Williams' athleticism, that he could end up being like a David Montgomery type. But I think there's more to his game than what Montgomery brings. So I'm down to draft him in the 104 spot, though this tier is fairly big. Now, Kyle Pitts comes next at number 5. I think Pitts is an incredible prospect who's also probably one of the safer prospects in this draft. The reason I don't have him in the top tier is because of the position that he plays, period. Not only is it difficult to be a difference maker at tight end, and not only do they just generally hold less value when you look at startup ADP, but the position is also fairly landing spot dependent. I hope that Pitts ends up going to Atlanta at 4, because it's a great spot for fantasy. But teams utilize their tight ends in drastically different ways across the league. Pitts hits on everything, though, that you want out of an elite tight end prospect. He can play out wide. He's got the best athleticism that we've seen since basically Vernon Davis. The production is there. I think Pitts is immediately a top 3 or 4 dynasty tight end. And he'll have a good shot to be a top 10 redraft tight end in the right spot. I don't want to spend too much time on him here because we know that he's good. But I have him where I have him because of positional importance. After Pitts in this same tier, I've got Rashad Bateman at wide receiver 2. Bateman is super solid across the board with fewer red flags than the other receivers in this class. And that's really why I have him at wide receiver 2. I do think that post-draft, this could change if one of the next handful of wide receivers finds a strong spot, or if Bateman doesn't have great draft capital. But among the 50 combine invites at wide receiver this year, Bateman's best season yards per team pass attempt ranks 5th, and he has one of the better breakout ages in the class. He saw 37% of Minnesota's passing yards go his way as a sophomore, and that was while playing alongside NFLer Tyler Johnson. There's some concern that Bateman weighed in 20 pounds less than where he was listed at in college. But he's noted that he had a scary battle with COVID and he dropped some weight as a result. And the other thing too is that he tested like a solid lighter wide receiver, or a player who's not 210 pounds. He tested like he should have tested given his weight. He had a good pro day with good speed. Like I said, I do think that post-draft, the wide receiver 2 spot could change. There's a group of 6 wide receivers who could realistically jump to that spot, but for now, Bateman's my guy. After Bateman is probably my most controversial take among players in the top 20, and that's having Terrace Marshall as my wide receiver 3. Now, there are medical concerns that popped up last week that could affect his draft capital. It might push Terrace Marshall back in the draft. If he falls further than I thought he'd go even just a couple of weeks ago, I'll gladly bump him down this list post-draft. That's what we do with more information. We don't need to have take lock. And I have no problem if you'd rather go with one of the Alabama wide receivers over Terrace Marshall. I just see a really high ceiling for Marshall. He's got a size profile that's tough to find in this small wide receiver class where he's 6'3" and weighs 205 pounds. And he tested well. He's athletic. As you guys know, I prospect very, very heavily through production. The athleticism side really doesn't matter that much. It's more subjective. The 3 main production metrics that I focus on for wide receivers are best season receptions per game, best season yards per team pass attempt, and best season touchdown share. Standalone, yards per team pass attempt is the most predictive, and it gets the most weight in my model. But those are the metrics that fit together to try and solve what I was trying to accomplish. Terrace Marshall doesn't have absurdly good marks in those categories. He's got a below average yards per team pass attempt, which is definitely a red flag. That's a concern. But I don't blindly follow my model, like I've said. I think there's important context with Marshall that isn't captured with his production. For those of you who don't know, Marshall played at LSU and was part of that 2019 team that had Joe Burrow. It also had Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. You could argue that Marshall's teammate wide receiver competition that year as a sophomore is better than what he's going to see in the NFL. He was competing with Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson. That season, Marshall hurt his foot during the team's 4th game. He basically missed the second half of that contest. Through that game, he actually had just 1 fewer reception than Justin Jefferson and 1 more touchdown. Jamar Chase through that time had missed a game, so it's not as much of an apples to apples comparison. So Marshall, at the very least, was competitive with 2 incredibly good prospects. And then this past year happens. Marshall becomes the guy at LSU since Jamar Chase didn't play, and he moves into Justin Jefferson's role as mostly a slot receiver. He played in 7 of 10 games for LSU because he opted out early, so his season-long numbers don't look as strong. But in the games that he played, he accounted for 28% of LSU's receptions, 33% of the team's yards, and an absolutely absurd 59% of the team's touchdowns. So his freshman season doesn't do a lot. That happens with freshmen. Sophomore year, he's competing well, but he gets hurt and his numbers don't look as strong as a result. And then he opts out early his junior season. Analytically, across the fantasy football world where people think more analytically, I feel like if Marshall had just played every game for LSU this past year, his profile wouldn't be so controversial. He made the choice to opt out. It's not like he had poor play. This is why I don't view this as making an excuse for Marshall that I'm not making for other players. The circumstances last year were not normal. Players were playing through a pandemic. With someone like Henry Ruggs, when he was coming out, people were making an excuse for his lack of baseline numbers, saying that it was the result of teammate competition. I've viewed the teammate competition side of things to hurt a ceiling more than a floor. Ruggs never had that baseline. He never had that floor. Terrace Marshall has the floor. He just checks a lot of boxes. He's got the size, like I said. He's still just 20 years old. He's an early declare, which is important. And get this, he moved more to the slot this past year, but according to Pro Football Focus, when he lined up on the outside across his collegiate career, quarterbacks had a perfect quarterback rating throwing Terrace Marshall's way. I hope he can find a good spot with good draft capital. That latter piece may not happen because of these medicals, but I'll likely still be higher on Marshall than the consensus post-draft. Now, after Marshall are the Alabama wide receivers, and they close off this second tier. I've got Devontae Smith ahead of Jalen Waddle right now, and I'll likely have that post-draft. I'm not one who's fading Devontae Smith strictly because of his BMI. Does BMI matter at wide receiver? Yeah, it's in my model, so it does to some degree, but it doesn't matter as much as a lot of people think. I did an entire episode on this topic. You can listen back to it. It's episode 488. Smith's production profile is great. It's elite. I've got no issues there. I actually think the biggest red flag is the lack of early declare status. We can sit here and say, oh, that doesn't matter. He won the Heisman and showed that he's really good last year. And that's not wrong, which is why I've still got Smith in this second tier very, very easily. And it's why I'm open to Smith moving up to the wide receiver 2 spot if things break certain ways during the draft. The reason I think it still matters, though, this early declare status, is because there's signal there. We've seen 53 wide receivers since 2006 get drafted in round 1. That's where my prospect model dates back to. Of those 53, 13 were not early declares. So they played all 4 years in college. And of those 13, only 5 of them posted one single 1,000-yard season in the NFL. Only one of those non-early declares posted more than one. That was Dwayne Bowe. It's not everything. It's just something. The early declare stuff points towards a player being talented. He wouldn't leave school early unless he thought that he was maximizing his draft capital, his draft potential. And if a player is going early as an early declare, he's likely got some talent. So ask yourself, if Devontae Smith were a first rounder last year, what are the chances that he'd actually stay at Alabama? I don't know the answer to that. No one knows the answer to that. But that adds to the ambiguity. And he did. He stayed at Alabama. Because in my eyes, he probably wouldn't have been a first rounder. And then he has the season that he has, which just created this combination of so many factors that we'd never seen before. That's why I'm totally cool with saying, I don't know. Like, why should I pretend to have these concrete answers on these players when my job is to find trends and help people win in fantasy football? The problem with Smith is that trends don't exist for him. We can say that low BMI players haven't hit in the NFL. But we can also show that Smith, when he's inevitably a first-round pick later this week, he joins Demaryius Thomas and Dez Bryant as the only first-round wide receivers in my model with a best season yards per team pass attempt rate above 4. So I fully recognize Devontae Smith's ceiling. If he ends up slipping in rookie drafts because people are worried about his size, I will gladly take him. I just think that there are still some red flags, like his lack of early declare status and him not having the best breakout age in the world. The big differentiator for me between Marshall and Smith isn't so much the safety of the prospect. Smith is a safer prospect. It's the ceiling. Marshall has alpha size while checking boxes of an alpha fantasy football asset. Smith doesn't check all those boxes. Now with Jalen Waddle, I want to start out by saying that Jalen Waddle is not Henry Ruggs. Ruggs had an absolutely crap production profile. Waddle, despite being injured last year, has a better profile in my model. He also had a really strong freshman year where he finished with more receiving yards than Ruggs, Devontae Smith, and Irv Smith. Jerry Jeudy had more that year, but that was it. And those guys were older in terms of college years than Jalen Waddle was. Now, Waddle's sophomore year saw him lose snaps, which could have easily been the result of seniority. And then last year, competing with Devontae Smith, Waddle caught 25 balls for 557 yards in 4 games before being hurt. He had more yards than Devontae Smith through that point in time. Now, within my model, Jalen Waddle has a negative stat score, and he's almost a lock to be a first rounder. In the history of my model, no wide receiver with a negative stat score who was drafted in round 1 has hit, at least so far. 9 players fit that mold. Brashad Perriman, Philip Dorsett, Kelvin Benjamin, Cordero Patterson, Darius Hayward-Bay, Ted Ginn, Craig Davis, Anthony Gonzalez, and Henry Ruggs. None of them were fantasy studs for a large stretch of time. I do think Waddle has a good chance to buck that trend given the context of his profile. But because of the profile that he has, and the fact that we have to do some projecting, I'm having a hard time elevating him to like wide receiver 2 status in this class. So a new tier starts after Waddle, and it's 2 players deep. It's Elijah Moore and then Rondale Moore. I'm a big fan of both Moores. I just have concerns that both players could end up being locked into a slot role at the next level, and that would make them a little bit more landing spot dependent. But if one goes to like Green Bay or to Kansas City, I'd feel a lot better about them both in the short and long term. And for the record, when I say that I'm worried about them being locked into more of a slot role, it's not that I'm totally concerned about them not producing at all in fantasy football at the next level. It's more that if they're strictly slot players, their ceiling is just inherently capped. It's hard and pretty rare for strictly a slot receiver to be a high-end wide receiver in fantasy football. And I'm not talking like Keenan Allen types. I'm talking Cole Beasley types, or even Juju Smith-Schuster, who hasn't been nearly the same type of fantasy receiver since moving to the slot more full-time. I think Elijah Moore has more upside to not just be that, though. His production profile is one of the best in this class. He had a 36% reception share both as a sophomore and a junior. His yards per team pass attempt rate is 8th best in the class, and his touchdown share is 4th best. My comp for Elijah Moore is Tyler Lockett, where I could see him playing a good bit in the slot, but still being a team's number 2 guy and moving more to the outside as he develops. But that development piece is key, because according to Pro Football Focus, he had a 78% slot snap rate last season, and only 38 snaps were against press coverage. So there's some projecting that's going on with Elijah Moore, and that's fine, but that comes with a little bit of risk. With Rondale Moore, he's got one of the most interesting profiles that we've seen in recent memory. My model takes the best seasons out of these particular production metrics, and all of Moore's best season numbers came from his freshman campaign. And despite that, he still has one of the best production profiles in this class. That's how insane his freshman season was. But he hasn't been able to stay healthy over the last couple of years. He's really undersized at just 5'7", though he's insanely athletic, and he's a part of #TeamThick. And he only played 67 snaps out wide throughout college. I kind of see Rondale Moore's ceiling being a combination of T.Y. Hilton and Curtis Samuel. But I think we see him play more of a slot role and stay closer to the line of scrimmage to start his career. And that could really limit his upside if he's on a team that doesn't throw the ball a whole lot, or if he finds an offensive scheme that's not creative. Now that's something that's hard to predict even just 2 years down the line. So he's not dropping if his landing spot isn't phenomenal. I highly doubt that Rondale Moore will drop outside my top 7 wide receivers. It's just that if the landing spot isn't great, he won't be rising in these rankings post-draft. At tier 4, I've got 4 wide receivers. This wide receiver class is objectively better than the running back one, so to me it makes sense that I basically only talked about wide receivers over the last 10 or so spots. That's also part of the reason that it's easier to go running back with an early pick within this class, because there's still some good wide receivers to choose from in the second round. But at the 12th spot is Tylan Wallace. He's one of 11 wide receivers in this class that hit a 3.0 yards per team pass attempt rate. And when you filter those players down to the ones with a breakout age under 20 years old, you have Rashad Bateman, Elijah Moore, Isaiah McCoy, and Tutu Atwell. McCoy's out of a smaller program in Kent State, and Atwell weighs like 40 pounds less than I do. So there's a reason that those two aren't getting more love, and Atwell is actually getting some love. Production is not the problem for Wallace. It's more the fact that he didn't declare early, and for an explosive wide receiver, or with that element being so important to his game, he didn't test exceptionally well. This is sort of where I insert that subjectivity with athletic testing. Now, maybe this is all tied to an ACL tear from 2019, but that's still a concern too. I think he's a super solid prospect though. And like Curtis Patrick mentioned on the show last week, Wallace could be considered in a tier above where I have him placed. I feel pretty good about him. I feel good about Dyami Brown too, who's next on this list. Tylan Wallace had good deep ball numbers last year, ranking 5th in deep ball catches across college football. But Dyami Brown did as well. He was 2nd in deep ball yards, and he was 7th in average depth of target. That put together a yards per team pass attempt rate of 3.08, which is a top 10 number in this class. He also had back-to-back seasons of 20 or more yards per reception. I think there is some concern that Dyami Brown translates into being some one-trick pony. Like maybe a little bit better than a Marquez Valdez-Scantling. But he at least has a trick. He'll have some role right away that he can then build off of. Now at 14 on my list is Kadarius Toney. And I got to be honest with you guys. I have him placed here not because I think he's a very good prospect. Or at least a safe prospect. It's just that his draft capital is projected to be strong, and that alone boosts him in some way. But Toney's one of those players in my model with a negative stat score. If he goes in round 1, then he'll be grouped with the aforementioned players who didn't pan out in the NFL. And the difference between him and someone like Jalen Waddle statistically, even though they have negative stat scores, Waddle has that early declare status, whereas Toney doesn't. So not only does Toney not have production, but he's also not an early declare, which historically has been a recipe for disaster for first-round picks. But we can't deny Toney's ability with the ball in his hands. He's electric. He moves in ways that human bodies don't move. That may give him an intriguing ceiling in the league, but I still think he's got more bust potential than success potential, despite potential first-round capital. And then rounding out this tier is Amon-Ra St. Brown. I've sort of viewed St. Brown as a high-floor, low-ceiling prospect throughout this process. He actually never led his college team in receiving yards. That's somewhat of a concern. But he did play alongside Michael Pittman up until last year. When last year hit, though, St. Brown's receiving yard and reception shares both went down. And that happened when he moved from playing 89% of his snaps from the slot in 2019 to just 28% in 2020. So he faced tougher coverage on the outside and he performed worse. That's not a great sign. The good signs, though, are that he's got decent enough size, he's an early declare, and he had a really strong breakout age. So I think he belongs in this tier. And with draft capital, he should be a solid second-round rookie pick. So I've got 5 more players to talk about today. The first 4 are technically in a separate tier than the 5th, but I'll group them all up to close out today's show. At 16, I have Trevor Lawrence. I don't think much needs to be said about Lawrence, but I do think that we should note that he has athleticism. He has that potential cheat code element to his game for fantasy purposes. He gets comped to Andrew Luck all the time, and I think that that kind of makes sense, especially when you think about what Andrew Luck did and what he could bring with his legs to fantasy football. Lawrence is a top prospect at the position, and he's the safest bet at quarterback in Dynasty. After Lawrence, I've got my RB4 in this class finally, and that's Trey Sermon. Given Sermon's college journey, he doesn't have a complete production profile whatsoever. He really wasn't a true workhorse in any full season in college. But here's the thing. This running back class kind of sucks, and it lacks size. So the RB4 spot is wide open, and Sermon is one of the few backs in this class who could step in and be a competent starter right away. And I could see a team falling in love with him after he posted 331 yards on the ground against Northwestern in the Big Ten Championship, and then 193 against Clemson in the college football semifinal. If draft capital is there, then Sermon should be the RB4 in this class. Absolutely. I think there's a chance that we see him fall to one of those attractive landing spots where you could see immediate work. And that would make him more of the consensus RB4 in this class, whereas that's not the case right now. At 18, I've got Justin Fields. Jim Sonis alluded to this on the quarterback episode from about a month ago, but almost 88% of Fields' attempts last season came against SP Plus top 50 defenses. Fields saw the toughest schedule of any quarterback that's been drafted since 2010. All the while, Fields ranks in the 74th percentile in adjusted yards per attempt among first-round quarterbacks since 2000. So he has good passing numbers, and then he goes out and he runs a 4.44 40. The athleticism is there to be a crazy good dual-threat quarterback. Now, we'll see how this quarterback group shakes out, but for now, Fields is my QB2 at 18th overall. After Fields is then Kenneth Gainwell. Gainwell is the type of running back that I fall in love with every single draft. He's got the second best reception share in this running back class, and at Memphis, he played ahead of Antonio Gibson. He led all Memphis backs back in 2019 in rush attempts by a pretty huge margin. That was his last collegiate season. The reason he's not ranked higher is size. He weighed in at 201 pounds at his pro day, and the fear is that a team is only going to want to use him as a satellite back at the next level. Antonio Gibson was a size speed freak. Gainwell's not that, unfortunately. I love him as a prospect because I love these types of running backs, but I have to be objective, and I have to recognize there could be a cap ceiling for Gainwell in the NFL. And then lastly, at number 20, it's Michael Carter. Like I said earlier, Carter did have comparable production to Javonte Williams last year. But my fear with Carter is that you have this smaller framed running back who's just 201 pounds, who also didn't test with a lot of speed. The difference analytically between Carter and Gainwell is that Carter was a decent bit slower at his pro day. I think he's also going to be forced into a satellite back role at the next level, and that limits upside. That's why I've got Sermon ahead of both of those guys. But as we know, landing spot and draft capital matter a lot more at running back than they do at wide receiver. So we'll see how things work out. There's a chance that the non-big three running backs see some changes in post-draft rankings. So that's it. That's my top 20. You can find the rest of my rankings over on numberfire.com, or you can hit me up on Twitter and I'll send them your way. Once the draft is over, I'm going to redo the rankings. At that time, we'll have landing spots, we'll have draft capital. And while landing spots can be overrated and overstated sometimes, the draft capital piece is important. If someone drops who we don't think will drop, we've got to adjust with that new information. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet to subscribe to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks, everyone. I'm going to do the mailbag episode on Thursday this week, so that should drop Thursday morning. I'll talk to you then.